The next speaker of a case example of what's possible in South Australia, we have David Geddes, and he's Director of Geddes Management. He's going to talk about wood pellet potential from the Green Triangle. David's been involved, and I'm sure you're no stranger to all the people sitting around here because you're from the local area, but he's been involved in softwood plantation management, forest research, logging contracting, sawmill management, and most recently looking at biofuels industry and wood pellets. So I welcome David.
Thank you. Hello everybody. Look, I'm a forester. I'm not an engineer or an energy expert, but my area of expertise with this is trying to understand fibre volumes from the forest industry, and my particular interest in wood pellets is in the southeast or in the Green Triangle here. And just for you who aren't interested, don't know the forest industry very well, we term the region here as both sides of the border. We call it the Green Triangle, but it's Western Victoria and southeast South Australia. But my particular interest has been, ever since the Kimberley-Clark pulp mill closed about 4 years ago, we've had a surplus of small diameter wood fibre, and in the last 4 years we've been exporting much of that, but I've been keen to find alternative options. So I guess with bioenergy, there's a few key things that you need. You need a long-term sustainable fibre supply. You need that fibre to meet the requirements of whoever's going to use it. It needs to have a price that's economical. It needs to have a favourable political climate, and it needs to have a favourable energy cost environment. And most of those things I think I can show you from the Green Triangle we fit quite well. But first of all, if you don't know what wood pellets are, they're an alternative fibre fuel source to coal and for home heating and for industrial heating. They're little 8mm pellets, quite small little things, but the process to make them is actually a pretty simple process once you've got a fibre source. And you can make it out of all sorts of fibres, but most of the pellets in the world are made of forestry fibres. So it's initially chipped to get it to a uniform size, dried to get it to a uniform moisture content, then it's hammer milled and conditioned with superheated steam to make it ready to go into the pellet press, and then it's forced through, and that's a pellet press there, it's forced through little holes, you can see all those little holes there, to come out as these pellets, and as this superheating and forcing is going on, the lignin from the wood is extruded and it releases and binds the pellet. So as the pellet comes out, it comes out at a very hot temperature, but as it cools, it hardens. And so you end up with this product that looks like that, that's reasonably easy to transport and is used, as I said, for alternative fuels. To convert fibre to pellets, it depends on what the fuel is. The better the quality of the fuel, the better the conversion. So if you just have leaves and bark and rubbish off the forest floor, you'll have a terrible conversion factor. If you do whole tree chipping, and this was one of my operations in Western Australia a few years ago, where we were cutting down burnt blue gum trees and sending them to the pellet plant at Albany. So we were chipping the whole tree, all the branches and everything, leaves, and we were getting a pellet conversion of 1 green metric tonne to 0.55 tonne of pellets. But if you take wood, like pulpwood, just from a tree, then you get a much better conversion, 0.65. So we'll think more about that during the presentation. So where are the markets? The main markets are Europe and America and Italy. And then after that, Sweden, Denmark, Germany, and UK, Italy, Denmark and South Korea are key importers of pellets, and I'll talk more about other importers later on. But interestingly, in Europe, 75% of the European pellet demand is actually met from European suppliers. the reason I've got that graph there of the Japanese situation is in this region we've had a long history of supply to Japan in terms of wood chip. And Japan is a fairly major pellet user as well, but most of the pellets in Japan come from Japanese forests, and you'll be surprised to know that in Japan they have 5 times the area of plantation that we have in Australia, which is quite amazing given their topography. But this little graph here is just showing you the pellet production in Japan since 2003. Been a fairly big jump, but they're still importing some pellets, and a lot of those are coming from Australia. So what are the political demand drivers? And the first presentation gave us a hint to some of those, but Europe is a key pellet demand driver, where they're replacing coal with biofuels, bioenergy, as a means to reduce greenhouse gases. So it's a political issue. And the UK, Denmark, Belgium and the Netherlands were very heavily dependent on coal. They don't have a lot of biofuel alternatives, so they're major importers. And again, the first presenter gave a bit of a hint on this, but there's an EU 2020 that requires the doubling of energy produced from renewable resources by 2020 from a base in 2005. So there's a big need in Europe for these alternative energy sources. And each of the countries in Europe have different targets, and it depends on their socioeconomic situation and all sorts of other things, but they have to develop a plan to be able to double this energy production from renewable resources, and that's where the pellets come in. Now, I mentioned that the EU is a fairly major producer of pellets. In fact, 75% of all of the pellets in the EU come from the EU itself, but despite that, the EU is a fairly big importer of pellets, and this is a graph of pellet imports into the EU since 2009. It's a fairly big jump. So we're talking about a pretty big market. And this is some data that just came out last week. This is from International Wood Markets Group, and they put out a report about every quarter, and this was their report from last week. They're saying that global wood pellet production is continuing to expand to meet the demand, as you'd expect. The demand growth is due to the government policies to reduce greenhouse gases. They say that wood and woody biomass for energy production and for heating is one of the fastest growing sectors of the wood and energy sectors. And the thing that's really interesting with their work is they estimate that global pellet consumption will grow from 28 million tonnes last year to 49 million tonnes by 2020, so nearly double in 5 years. That's a fairly big jump in pellet demand. So where are the main suppliers for pellets? I've mentioned a few times now, EU is the major supplier. The 2014 data was that 48% came from Germany, Sweden, Latvia, France and Portugal, 30% from the US, and I know more about the US situation than I know about the EU situation, and 22% from the rest of the world, including Australia fits into that. And that's pellets going along a conveyor belt in the Australian plant at Maryborough. This is some data I got from Wood Resources International at a conference I went to in Georgia last year, and this is showing the pellet trade from North America to the EU, and particularly the big jump from the US in the last 5 years or so, a really big jump. And this next picture just gives you a bit of a feel for the US. It's a bit of a complicated slide here, but those dark green dots were operational wood pellet plants in the US in 2014. And the blue ones are proposed plants in 2014, and the bigger the dot, the bigger the plant, and those really big dots are 500,000 tonne pellet plants. If you think about the world, America, the east coast of America is very well placed to export to Europe. It's just got to go across the Atlantic. Whereas the east coast, the west coast is like us. We're a long way from Europe, but they're quite close to Japan and China and other Asian countries. But the big growth in pellet production in the US is in the US South. And all these ports, all the major ports down the US South, from Virginia, the Carolinas, right through Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and right through to East Texas, this is a major wood basket supplier of wood pellets for the world and mostly to Europe. So an interesting story, and I found it fascinating when I was in Georgia last year that they just have so many plants to use their forests. They don't have to work very hard, the foresters there, I don't think, compared with us, who really have a difficulty finding markets. So what does the Green Triangle offer? And as I mentioned, the Green Triangle is that area of Western Victoria and southeast South Australia, so we don't think of ourselves as the limestone coast or the southeast bit. The border's just invisible to us, except we've got different regulations each side of the border. First of all, it's the largest forestry plantation area in Australia. Nearly 18% of all of Australia's plantation forests are in this region. 355,000 hectares, about half pine and half blue gum. Most of the forests are internationally environmentally certified to be sustainable production. So I think about 90% of the plantation forests in the region have international environmental certification, which is important for wood pellet supply. Wood pellet manufacturers, because of the environmental or the greenhouse gas political market they're going into, all of their supplies have to be from sustainable forests. We have pretty flat terrain here, so it's one of the easiest areas in Australia for harvesting and haulage. And since the Kimberley-Clark pulp mill closed about 4 years ago, we've had a surplus of small diameter roundwood. And currently we export from the region about 3 million tonnes a year of hardwood wood chips from the blue gum plantations, about a bit over 500,000 tonnes of pine chips. That's down a bit. It was up to 1 million tonnes at one stage, but it's sustainably about 0.6 of a million tonnes of blue gum, of pine chips from the region each year, and 1.3 million tonnes of pine logs each year. A lot of those would have been suitable for making pulp, and we don't have a pulp mill in the region now, so it wouldn't be very hard at all to divert some of that wood into the pellet market. And I'll show you in a moment some of the work I've done on resources. And we've got a port in the region. So where could we get the fibre from for a pellet plant in this region? And what I've done here is listed the sources of fibre, and this isn't just for pellets, it could be for anything, but I'm particularly looking at pellets, in terms of volume available and cost. So the most volume and the least cost is at the top, and the least volume and the most cost is at the bottom. So sawmill residues are ideal. The wood pellet plant that's in Queensland near Maryborough is next to a sawmill, so it gets its sawmill sawdust, other waste straight into the pellet plant. Pine first thinnings, T1 stands for first thinning, whole tree chip, that's chipping the whole tree, probably just knocking the tops off of the tree so you don't get quite as many needles into the pellet, so you keep the pellet tonnes up. That's probably the biggest volume, but it's not the least cost. The least cost is sawmill residues. And for pine first thinning whole tree chip, and I'll show you a map of this in a moment, the sustainable supplies here ad infinitum for 500,000 tonnes a year of this product each year. Pine clear felling broken logs, for those who've been around the forests here, you'd see after clear felling operations in the pine plantations often little heaps of debris around the place. They're the broken bits that were no good for sawmills, and sometimes they get chipped for fuel, but often they're just burnt these days, and they're ideal because they're easy to pick up, ideal for pellet production. Fire damage plantations is one of my interests because I deal with a lot of, I'm a consultant and I deal with plantation fires all over Australia, and one of the biggest issues is how do you salvage the wood. That's how I got involved with the Albany pellet plant, because for about 2 years I was the major supplier of wood to their plant from several burnt plantations, burnt blue gum plantations. This one will probably surprise you a bit, but in blue gum plantations some trees die and they're no good for wood chip if they're dead. But we also have a koala problem down here. The foresters, not that many foresters in the room, but those involved in the forest industry would understand that the koala population has quadrupled in the last 10 years in this region as the blue gum plantations have developed. Once upon a time, people used to say there were only 3 eucalypts that koalas would eat, but that's not true at all. There's 600 species of eucalypts and they eat the whole darn lot. But when you're harvesting, you have to, and if you identify koalas, one of our local rules is you leave a group of trees where those koalas are so you don't hurt the koalas, and it means that after the harvesting operation is complete, there's these little patches of 5 to 10 trees all over the place that are left behind, and that's a possible source. Logging residue, when I first got involved with the Economic Development Board down here doing work on biofuels about 5 or 6 years ago, that was what everybody thought would be the big fuel source from the forest, the debris that's left behind, the branches and the needles and the bark and that sort of thing. There are some issues with that. First of all, sustainability issues. A lot of the forestry companies prefer to leave that debris on the ground to rot down and release the nutrients back into the soil. But also it's a very expensive thing to pick up, so it's quite expensive to pick up. And stumps is another possibility. These pictures here are from Scandinavia, but and they're doing less and less of it these days because they're looking at the sustainability issues. But that was an operation where they were pulling out stumps, and that's where they were picking up forest debris and putting it into bales like hay bales. So my thing is those are the areas where we're going to be getting the supply of pellet material. Yeah, I'm nearly there. Skip over that one. This is a bit of a messy slide. It's some work I did about 3 or 4 years ago looking at fibre supplies from a range of centres. I looked at the old cellulose pulp mill site, the Saffrise site between Penola and Nangwarry, which is now being used for a milk powder factory, the Tarpina sawmill and sawmills in Mount Gambier, and the Wandello area that was looked at by another company for pellet production a number of years ago. And what I looked at is how much fibre would be available within 100 kilometres and within 120 kilometres of those sites. I've done some work more recently for another company, and I looked at the Tarpina site and Penola as potential spots to put the plant. It didn't make any difference at all whether you had it at Penola or Tarpina or Mount Gambier. You've pretty well got the same volume available each year for the next 20 years. I only looked at 20 years out into the future. But there's certainly plenty enough fibre from just the first innings of our pine plantations to have a world-scale pellet plant in this region. We have a port that's expert in exporting forestry products, and they're well aware of the pellet market. I've met with the port people when I've been in America, the Port of Portland people, and they're interested in the pellet situation. One of the things about pellets, they don't like to be stored outside. If they get rained on, they deteriorate. So these are wood chip piles down at Portland being exported. The wood pellets can't be exported like that. They've got to be under a shed, but the Port of Portland have got a shed earmarked for a potential site. So just in summary, this is the largest plantation forestry area in Australia. It's environmentally audited for sustainability. There are enormous potentials for growers and manufacturers in this region for wood pellets, and there is at least one grower seriously looking at a wood pellet factory in the region right at the moment. We've got reliable long-term supplies from both the pines and the blue gums, but the blue gum area is probably going to decrease a little over the next few years, and pretty large volumes available, providing there's a competitive price paid. So thank you.
Do we know why the fruit is closed? Didn't know
Yeah, the Wandello part, Neville, I think that you're talking about the Wandello plant. At that time, the pellet, there's a criticism of pellets by some people who want to try and value add the small diameter wood in this region, and some people rudely call the pellet game a bottom feeder market, a bit like a pulp market. You know, it's the lowest value. It's very much dependent on the costs, and at the time, and pellets are sold in US dollars. And at the time, our dollar was better than $1. So, and that's been one of the problems with the pellet plant in Western Australia as well. That was mothballed for about 3 years, just starting up now, but it was mothballed because of the exchange rate. But I think most people think the exchange rate, when it was about 1 for 1, was a bit of an abnormal thing to do. We didn't expect that to happen. It was a GFC-related situation, and most economists say that our exchange rate where it is now is about where it ought to be in the longer term. And at that rate, we're very competitive. And interestingly, our blue gum wood chip market is very competitive now. It wasn't 2 or 3 years ago, but it is very competitive now. So that was the real issue with the Wandello site. We've got a wood pellet manufacturer who operates in Queensland now who's seriously interested in this region, and he exports to Japan and to Europe from Queensland and understands the volume that's available from this region. Alan?
How big is the potential in the domestic market for substitute for coal if government policies change, I suppose, and maybe burning and home fires as well?
The burning and home fire one, there is a market for that. There's a market in Australia for it. Australians like to press a button to turn the heater on. And I guess that's one of the things about the wood pellet heaters. They are a bit like pressing a button. They're not like a wood-fired heater. And more and more of them are being sold these days, but I've never been in a house that's heated by a wood pellet heater. I've seen them at exhibitions and things like that. In terms of the market for Australian coal, I guess you almost answered the question when you gave it, that it depends on the market incentives and that sort of thing. The real drivers of these pellet production systems in the US and other places are Europe, who have this very big imperative to move away from coal. Whether Australia goes to that stage, who knows? Yeah, so 6 million tonnes. We'd be talking a pellet factory, if we had one in this region, probably 5 to 600,000 tonnes.
What would you say about the economic and sustainable size for a pellet operation in this region?
The bigger the better, and I've been looking at a 500,000 tonne pellet plant, and the benefits for the region are, the growers here have actually done reasonably well with exports just in the last few years, but the export market is quite a fickle market, very much reliant on China, and China has its ups and downs every year, and every now and again all their ports get chock-a-block with logs, and they just say, stop, no more. And you can cope with that for a while, but it's much better to have a regular market nearby. And that's one of the benefits of attracting a bottom feeder market, to use that rude term, like a pellet market here, because we'd have a regular market. It would create jobs in the region, but it's a sustainable, always there market. And from my mind, the other benefit is we've got a way to use timber from burnt forests, because nearly all of the forests, nearly all of the uses for wood have some component of wood chip in them, and wood chip is used for making high quality paper from this region, has a zero tolerance for char. So if you have a forest that's burnt, it's very difficult to export the chip. So sawmills don't like taking burnt log because they're going to pollute their chip with char. So there's an opportunity to sell burnt wood through a pellet plant, because the pellet plant doesn't mind if there's char in there.
Is hardwoods other than blue gum and cypress not only possible to make them wood?
Yeah, any wood type is possible. One of the keys to making pellets is you've got to try and get a uniform fibre, and you can mix your softwood and hardwood, and that's what they've done in Western Australia at the Albany plant. They've mixed pine, debris and blue gum thinnings. So you can use anything, but you've got to get it to a uniform fibre. So you chip it and pulverise it and superheat it, steam it and all the rest of it to get it so you can push it through those little plates to make it into the pellets. Ross, I think you had a question.
What's the situation with regards to green credits or similar?
That's not my area of expertise. I'm a forester. I'm sure there's someone else in the room who could tell you about that.
You mentioned lithium external storage and pellets. Have you actually looked at the clarified pellet approach instead? That makes a hydrophobic pellet.
Personally, I haven't. And the pellet operations I've been involved with, which is the Queensland one and the Western Australian one, they store it undercover. They store the pellets undercover. And the Port of Portland have indicated that they've got a shed available at Portland. It's being used for something else at the moment, but could be used for pellets if the pellet plant got up.
So I think we've got time for one more question.
For a statement about the regulatory environment, I think I've differentiated many of the markets that we ourselves built into develop very quickly is that there's obviously the government support for the growth of those industries, but it includes the element of support for the heat from the generation of electricity or the use of the pellet in industrial sense, but also that low grade becomes on track. I know that's really in many places in Europe, definitely true in Japan, Canada, the US, and state by state area, but some have big credits. I think that's what's missing in the Australian renewable energy target and the incentives the government providing is almost myopic around they call it really exclusively represented. And the forest and forest price industry, the big element of our process is the demand for those low-grade energy sources into our processes is very important. And we as an industry can find some way of extracting some support for the use of that, particularly for biomass sources. I think that's where the good growth opportunity comes from pellets and biomass developers in Australia. Really following our competitors around the world as well, which is giving them an advantage at the moment.
I'm taking that as a comment and not needing an answer.
Well, let's thank David very much for